Over the past 70 years, China and India have been battlefield enemies, wary neighbours, at times on friendlier terms, and more often than not, regional rivals. But they have managed to forge solid economic links. They are the two largest economies in Asia, with a rich 2,000-year-long history full of economic, religious, and cultural ties, dating back to the days of the ancient Silk Road. Their relationship has been complex, with territorial disputes that even led to a war in 1962, and clashes that led to military deaths along their disputed border as recently as June 2020. But despite the political tension, Beijing and New Delhi have certainly not ignored each other economically. India runs a trade deficit with China, meaning what it imports is worth more than what it exports to the country. It often imports more from China than anywhere else in the world. And China is an important destination for Indian exports. But the view is different from China's side. China imports relatively little from India, although India does remain a moderately important export market.
There's always been more of a protectionist sentiment in India, concern about China really being a competitor and not wanting to rely on them too much. Of course, there's also a bigger geopolitics at play where India wants to balance Chinese interests with being more closely allied to the United States and Western countries. The other thing, even though they're neighboring, the infrastructure between the direct infrastructure that connects India and China, this is the mountains, right? There's not huge highways. So the cost of transporting directly across that border is not that small. And China's population is not on that side of the country, right? It's on the coast. So it's not so obvious that just because they're next to each other, we should expect the amount of trade volume that we see, let's say, between the US and Mexico.
India imports a variety of things from China, including plastics, electrical machinery, auto parts, electronics like mobile phones, and pharmaceutical chemicals. It sends to China things like iron ore, steel, cotton, and fish. In fact, in the first half of 2020, Chinese purchases of Indian ore reached an 8-year high. Investment tends to flow from China into India rather than the other way round, and in recent years it's grown. The American Enterprise Institute says that Chinese investment in contracts in 2019 totaled $7.3 billion compared to $1.36 billion in 2009. It's currently quite contentious. In April, the Indian government decided that any investments Chinese firms wish to make in the country would need official approval. It's a protectionist measure that governments sometimes use to prevent foreign companies from acquiring domestic ones. There is also some fear that Chinese firms might use the current economic situation during the pandemic to dominate certain industries. Chinese companies also have a stake in around 2/3 of Indian startups, but China can be viewed as both a resource for Indian firms and a potential rival. India's been resistant to get on board with major Chinese geo-economic projects such as Beijing's multi-billion-dollar infrastructure development plan, the Belt and Road Initiative. But the tech industry is where India and China are quite intertwined. China has invested around $4 billion in India's tech companies since 2015, and Chinese smartphone companies, according to the Gateway House think tank, control an estimated 72% of the Indian market. But with TikTok and over 200 other Chinese apps now banned, what effect might that have?
Well, I don't think there's anything special about tech that will make it less susceptible to protectionism or other efforts. In fact, to some extent, it's a bit more sensitive these days because of the security concerns related to tech and information. That said, I think there's enormous benefit for India to engage China in the tech sectors. Of course, you can say banning TikTok doesn't really hurt the economy from an income sense, but economists think of consumer welfare as a real part of the economy. And so there's enormous harm to Indian consumers by not giving them access to apps that they enjoy, for instance.
India is a major global player in the pharmaceutical industry, but it gets most of the ingredients to make medical products from China. India overall gets about 70% of its supply of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China, and relies on it for over 90% of ingredients for drugs like paracetamol and amoxicillin.
If you are looking for the brains which allow a lot of these generic drugs to be manufactured, that still is in India. But certainly if you're looking at the raw material, that certainly comes from China. That is one example where the industry per se has had a lot of healthy interaction in terms of fairly robust supply chains that allow the Indian pharmaceutical sector to flourish. That's not something that is easily replicable by other countries. So even though China has active pharmaceutical ingredients, they are not in a position to simply replicate the position of dominance or at least the position of superior performance that India has in this particular sector.
So what do the experts think about the future economic relationship between these two Asian superpowers?
If we go further down this path of action, retaliatory action, and so on, that might also be an option that the Chinese start using, retaliatory action. Then you might start going down a path which might have a life of its own, and that may not augur well in terms of the overall needs for economic development and growth that both countries have.
The Indian and Chinese relationship is complex. The main point I really want to emphasize is that these are two of the largest economies in the world. And the other one is the United States, single economies. And so all of these countries have a very strong interest to engage each other economically. Because obviously, if you just close yourself off, there's going to be many opportunities that are lost, both in terms of financing and in terms of trade, comparative advantage. It would be really unfortunate if the countries could not find a political space to engage in a productive way with each other.
Relations between India and China may seem to be at an impasse given recent events along their disputed border, but it seems that politics rather than economics is preventing them from taking their relationship to the next level.